There you go. No? Yes. Okay. Hello. It's such a delight to be with all of you. And I always enjoy when people put in the chat where they're dialing in from because it's a wide variety of places and time zones. And it's really a beautiful reflection just to get a sense of that kind of gathering and people, we all coming together. So I am dialing in from New York City. Um, and it's in a way ironic for me to be talking about real life, which is the title of my most recent book, um, because it was born when I had to leave New York City in the beginning of the pandemic in March of 2020, and I uh, came here where I have a small rental apartment from which I am speaking right now, and thinking, I'd be here. And then things in New York were really intense and very difficult. As you may recall, a lot of people I know, their parents were getting very sick, um, and sometimes dying. There was tremendous anxiety spreading around. And so I thought kind of casually, well, I have a retreat center, the Insight Meditation Society in Barry, Mass, and an apartment and a house up there. So maybe I should go up there for 2 weeks and ride this out till it's all over. So I went up to Barry, Mass, March, I think 14th, 2020, with my snow boots, thinking I'd be there for 2 weeks. And of course, days went by and the retreat center had to close, and we quickly try to think about how we were going to survive, which meant getting online, which we'd never done before. And so we really worked with uh, all those elements, and I was there, and life was very different. And so the overriding question I kept asking myself over and over again, with expectations shattered and plans in disarray, and my retreat center, which was kind of like my baby, so threatened. And I thought, what's still true? What is essentially true? And this reminds me of, in the Buddhist teaching, the word dharma in Sanskrit, Dharma, which is usually described as the Buddhist teaching or the truth of things or the laws of nature, actually has a meaning of that which supports us, that which sustains us, that which we can count on, that which we can rely on. So I thought, okay, what is the dharma of this situation? What can I count on when everything I've been counting on before was kind of evaporated? And so I really looked deeply into that question. And right around that time, when I was still in Barry, for what turned out to be the long haul, uh, my publisher, my most recent publisher, wrote to me and said, "Wouldn't you like to write another book? Maybe something else in the real series." Somehow I'd gotten on the real train some time before. And so I paired that with that question, like, what's still true? What am I counting on? And what am I supported by when all these external conditions have gone crazy, And I thought, okay, what is the next iteration in the real series? And I thought, okay, real life. What is real life when we can't count on circumstances and we can't, manifest our expectations? And what is real life? What is most essential to me? What am I counting on? And so the premise of real life is basically our experience, which is that there are times when we feel trapped, we feel overcome, we feel isolated, we feel like the world is very small. And then there are times when, even starting from there, we can move. It's a journey to openness, to freedom, to some expansion. And that expansion is not vacuous, it's full of connection, it's born of connection. And so that became the trajectory of the book and of workshops like this. Now, those times when we feel like trapped and overcome and really uh, kind of isolated, they're not the same as being one pointed and determined and um, having a specific goal. It's not that. It really is that sense of overwhelm where some circumstance, either external circumstance or the things arising in our minds and bodies, are defining us. And so we don't necessarily see options. It's not a space where creativity can arise. So we're lost in some ways. And traditionally in the Buddhist teaching, we're lost in certain patterns that are described as the most essentially entrapping, not because they arise, but because we tend to get lost in them. So there's an underlying premise that we have the capacity, no matter what is coming up, to approach it in such a way that we experience freedom, even in really bad circumstances externally, even in kind of really difficult emotions or physical, conditions arising, even there, because of how we relate to those things, our experience can be very different. So this reminds me in many ways of the stress dynamic, which is really a dynamic. There's the pressure, the incident, the circumstance, and then there's the resource with which it's met. So there is, we know this like from ordinary life, right? Like maybe you didn't sleep all night and you go to work or you go to school, you go to a meeting somewhere and you overhear a comment somebody makes and you take it so to heart and it's really, really difficult for you. In contrast to you had a beautiful night's sleep and you had a loving breakfast with all these people you care about and you go off to work and you hear that comment and you think, wow, that person's having a really bad day. Right? We meet circumstance differently depending on the resource we can bring. And that sense of resource is sometimes born of inner strength. Sometimes it's born of not feeling so alone. And sometimes people hear this and they think it means that we never try to do anything to change external circumstance, an unfair work condition or unjust situation. And that's not true. But the question is why try to make a change from maximum depletion and exhaustion and overwhelm? Why not build a sense of inner resource? So some of that sense of inner resource comes from how we approach what is happening. What are we adding to it? And Buddhist teaching, sometimes it's referred to as the second arrow. Things can be bad enough, and this is not to say they don't get really bad sometimes or really challenging sometimes. But on top of that, we then may add all kinds of things, future projection. This is the only thing I'll ever feel. A sense of isolation. I'm the only one who ever feels anything like this. Blame. I should have rectified that tendency, that vulnerability long ago. It's all my fault. Which also reminds me of this point in the teaching. There's a word in Pali, the language of the original Buddhist text, called papancha, which means proliferation. I always liked it because I thought it's like one of those words that sounds like what it means. Papancha, that
Sharon,
which
Sharon,
I heard one translator once describe it as the imperialistic tendency of mind.
Sharon. I'm
Yeah.
so sorry. I'm so sorry to interrupt you. Just really briefly, some folks are letting me know that the volume is sounding
I saw
low.
that. I don't
Okay.
know. Is that
Um,
me?
it seems like that might be the case. So my question would be, let's see, because my question would be, um, there is a there is a button for the audio settings down by the microphone. There's that little arrow, and that there's an audio settings tab, and
Yeah,
there's
it's on the correct microphone.
yes. I'm just wondering if we open the settings and we could look at what your input volume is. I'm wondering
Oh,
if we could
good for
turn it up a
you.
little
Input volume
bit. Is it?
is, I'll make it higher. I don't know if this makes it any better.
We'll see. It seems like for some the volume is okay, and then for others that it's a little low. So we'll just try to see if
Yeah.
we can turn it up a little bit.
Well, I never knew to look at the input volume, but this is good. How is this better? I'm waiting to see I'm an inveterate chat reader, so I saw all that.
Doing two things at once, speaking and reading. Okay, let's see. Um,
Yeah, I also turned up that volume.
okay, let's see. Well,
Now you're deafening, but
that seems like it might be the best that we can do. I'm getting
okay.
others saying they can hear fine. So I'm sorry for folks who that's a little low, but I think that's the best that we can do in this moment. So,
Okay.
all right, sorry for the interruption. Please continue.
Yes, I had to think what I was talking about. I'm just
A
checking all these
papancha.
other things. Papancha, yes. So I once heard thank you. I once heard a translator describe it as the imperialistic tendency of mind, where something happens and the whole world is taken over. And some of you probably heard me tell this story because it remains my favorite story of describing papancha. So that is this time I was teaching with my friend, my colleague, Joseph Goldstein, and we were sitting in the kitchen, Joseph and I having a cup of tea, and someone came into the kitchen in some distress and said to Joseph, I just had this really terrible experience. And Joseph said, well, what happened? And he said, I felt all this tension in my jaw, and I realized what an incredibly uptight person I am and how I always have been and I always will be. And Joseph said, you mean you felt a lot of tension in your jaw? And he said, yes, and I've never been able to get close to people, and it's never going to change. And whatever, the guy said, which was an ever more elaborate story, Joseph would respond with, you mean you felt a lot of tension in your jaw? And it was really interesting for me going, like watching them go back and forth and back and forth. And finally, Joseph said something like, why are you adding a miserable self image to a painful experience? It's like painful enough, and genuinely so, to feel all that tension in your jaw. But on top of that, now you're going to be alone for the rest of your life, right? So that's proliferation. So that's not to say we wipe out the pain, and we enter this kind of make believe world where everything is just great. It's not great very often, either personally or collectively. And yet we do have this tendency sometimes of making it even worse. And that reminds me of another story where another friend, colleague Sylvia Borstein, tells this story about preparing a Passover Seder dinner with her then 9-year-old granddaughter named Honor. I just told this story in front of Honor, so that was nerve wracking, but she said I got it right. So Honor was 9 years old, and if anyone's not familiar with Passover Seder dinner, very commonly it would include classically this dish called gefilte fish, which is sort of an odd thing. It's like several different kinds of fish that one's grandma always kept in the bathtub, and chopped up and put into this sort of gelatinous mold. So it's an acquired taste. And traditionally it's served with horseradish. So Sylvia said to Honor, then 9 years old, I want you to take each plate and put a piece of gefilte fish on it and like a big tablespoonful of horseradish next to it. And Honor said, I never knew you could take something really terrible and make it even worse. So when Sylvia first told the story, she hastened to say she makes very good gefilte fish. Somebody just put in the chat they like gefilte fish. Some people do. Joseph, for example, loves gefilte fish. And I really like horseradish. So Sylvia hastened to say, I make very good gefilte fish. And I said, I really like horseradish. And I once told that story at a time I was teaching in New York, and it was lunch break just after, and there's a farmer's market just near where I was teaching, and I swear people came back with probably 15 jars of horseradish for me, which I then had to give away because I had so many. But the basic, idea is that some really terrible, not gefilte fish, but some really genuinely terrible things can happen in life, and sometimes we make them even worse. So that's not to say they don't count, they don't matter, they do matter, but it's like, why try to make change from maximum depletion, maximum identification with this difficult circumstance? So, how we approach, how we relate, and that is considered almost like the essence of mindfulness, where we're not lost in papancha, that proliferation, that tendency may arise, but we don't get so swept away by it. And we have the ability to approach, to relate to what is happening differently. So, mindfulness is considered a relational quality. It's not just noticing what's going on, but it's noticing with some balance. And this takes some exploration as well. I think that the earliest kind of research into mindfulness in this country, at least what I had seen, which was limited, of course, involved people trying to define and measure mindfulness because you couldn't really measure it until you could define it. And the teachings is defined in several different ways, but the main body of research that I saw initially was all about noticing. Like, do you notice you feel angry? Do you notice you feel joyous? Do you notice you feel sad? And this is, of course, crucially important, but it's only part of the picture of mindfulness, because mindfulness, I mean, you could notice you're angry with a lot of terror at that, and that's not really mindful, right? That's very reactive. You're noticing, so that's good. It's better than not noticing for sure. But it's noticing with a big reaction going on. You can notice that you're thinking with a lot of self blame. I shouldn't be thinking. No one else is thinking. They're all sitting here in bliss. Why am I thinking? That's not really mindfulness either. So, mindfulness means being aware of what's happening in a balanced way. That doesn't mean you're never going to do anything about anything. It's not a passive, complacent state, but fundamentally, mindfulness is something we cultivate for insight, for understanding. And it makes sense, right? Like if a certain emotion arises and you freak out about it right away, there's not going to be a lot of learning going on. If you grab onto it and you jump on that papancha train, there's not going to be a lot of learning going on. By learning, it's a very particular kind of learning. It means, let's say you're looking at anger. You may see a lot of other emotions in there: sadness, fear, helplessness. That's a learning that's important. It may arise with a bang and feel like it's going to be there forever. But when you really look at it, it's coming and going, it's ebbing and flowing, it's moving, it's shifting, it's changing, because everything is. That makes it an alive system. It's different. We look at, and painful feeling in the body is another example. It can feel solid and inert and unchanging. But when you really look at it, it's moments of burning and moments of twisting and moments of piercing, and none of that sounds good and none of that feels good, but it's an alive system. And as one of my friends with a very severe chronic pain condition once said, I found the space within the pain. It's not that the pain evaporated, but within it, there was movement, there was flow. It's a very different way of experiencing it. And we have a different way of responding to the circumstance when we have insight, when we have understanding. That's what the balance is all about. And to create a sense of space so we have options, we have creativity can arise in terms of how we respond. My favorite example of mindfulness, actually, many of you have heard me say this as well, came from reading an article in the New York Times many years ago. It was about a very, very early pilot program bringing mindfulness into the classroom. This was a fourth grade classroom in Oakland, California. And the journalist asked one of the kids, so he's in fourth grade, right? He's like 9 or 10 years old. He said to him, what is mindfulness? What is mindfulness? And the kid replied, mindfulness means not hitting someone in the mouth. That's what mindfulness means. And I thought that is a great definition of mindfulness. Because what does it imply? It implies, first of all, seeing you're feeling angry when you're starting to feel angry, not after you've sent the email, not after you've blown up at somebody, but right as it's emerging. You're that in touch. And it also implies a certain balanced relationship to the anger. If you freak out about feeling angry and you hate yourself and you're ashamed of it and you try to deny it or repress it, you get tighter and tighter and tighter until you explode. It's not going to work. But at the same time, if you are overwhelmed, if you're consumed by the anger, you're likely to hit a lot of people in the mouth because life can be really frustrating. So that place in the middle, we know what we're feeling, we're connected to it. There's some openness to experiencing it. There's some interest in it. There's some balance. We're not lost in it. We're not pushing away. And then space opens up. And in that space, that's where the options can arise. That's where new perspectives can arise. Creative thinking can arise. Like I like to think of that kid, the 9 or 10-year-old kid in that space thinking, hit someone in the mouth last week. Didn't work out that well. Maybe I'll try this. Maybe I'll try that. It's like we need that space for other options to appear. That's expansiveness. That's openness right in the midst of a normally kind of thorny, difficult feeling or situation. My friends who run an organization called the Holistic Life Foundation in Baltimore, Maryland, which brings tools like mindfulness and other meditations and yoga to inner city schools, told me a story, which I've often quoted in my books, about this young girl who was younger than 9 or 10. I think she was maybe 7 in one of their programs. And she was a fighter. She was the kind of kid that was teased a lot, probably bullied, but she would like knock kids out, in response. And so she was always in trouble. She was always in detention. And they taught her, some tools. And they said after that, they walked into like one of the public rooms, like the cafeteria or the auditorium or something. And she had another little girl up against the wall, holding her by the throat. And then she looked at her and said, you're just lucky I know how to meditate. And she dropped her and she went off and sat in a corner and kind of composed herself. So again, it's not like you never do anything about a really bad situation or something that seems unjust, something that's painful. But we can be creative about it. We don't have to be just mindlessly reactive and, thrust into like old habits. we can look for a better way. And so the mindfulness itself will have the flavor, it'll have the nature of expansiveness, of openness, no matter what is going on. And that's how we practice. The other, another element of that kind of expansion and openness is actually, in a way, cultivating the good. It's recognizing from our own experience that if we strengthen certain qualities, certain attributes like loving kindness, compassion for ourselves and for others, generosity, gratitude, that our world will open up. And, these aren't like just feel good qualities, they're much more powerful than that. And they have different consequences when we really cultivate them. So that's what we'll talk about a little bit later. But for now, going back to mindfulness, there are many, many ways that mindfulness is deepened and practiced in meditation and outside of meditation. Outside of meditation, it's often what some people call, some teachers have called short moments many times. Maybe for once, not multitasking and drinking your cup of tea, feeling the warmth of the teacup and smelling the tea and tasting the tea and really being present instead of drinking that cup of tea while also being on Zoom and also checking your email and also doing 15 other things. Short moments. Some activity maybe you do many times a day where you just pay attention. And there's been some research showing that that in itself will make difference in one's life. Another option, and the one I am very fond of, obviously, is formal meditation practice. And one of the reasons I like it so much is because for me, in truth, that other, be mindful throughout the day or different, not throughout the day because it won't be all day, but, different activities, short moments, many times becomes kind of theoretical often, but it's like a story I tell. You can be mindful whatever you're doing, and that's true. But will I be? Unlikely. Much more likely if I have also sat in a formal way, doing meditation or walked. The posture doesn't matter. But it's some dedicated period of actually cultivating that different relationship to the things that arise. The people I have found most successful at only doing short moments many times have been people who are suffering a lot, where it really matters. It's not like a story they tell blithely or glibly. It's like they can't necessarily sit in a concentrated way, but they can do this other thing, and it makes a big difference. But they actually do it. Like there was a woman I knew in India who she was a teacher. She was not one of my own teachers, but I knew her, a Bengali woman, and um, her story was very different than my own teacher. This woman named Jeepama, who was also put into an arranged marriage when she was very young, like 12 years old. But Deepama's story was different, where she and her husband really had a beautiful relationship. But maybe I'll tell her story later, actually. But this other woman was a teacher, and she'd been put into an arranged marriage, and it was a very difficult situation. And she lived with her in-laws, as was the custom, and they were quite tyrannical and would never let her practice meditation formally or go off to retreat or something like that. But she became very accomplished in meditation, and nonetheless. And so people would ask her, "How did you do that? Like, how did you, really develop insight and wisdom when you weren't allowed to really practice formally?" And she said, "I was very mindful stirring the rice." And I knew the difference between her and me is that she really was. And that for me, without a formal practice underlying, my efforts toward short moments many times, it would more likely become something I just say. So that's being very frank, and it's to say, like short moments many times they're fun. They really bring our experience to life. They're very helpful, and all in and of themselves, they can be really transformative. But I also say to myself, why do something in the hardest way possible? Why not do it in the easiest way possible for a change? And that is to have a platform of some amount of formal practice every day, just cultivating mindfulness. So that I do remember much more likely. Or another great example is from Thich Nhat Hanh, who said, don't pick up your phone on the first ring. Let it ring 3 times and breathe, and then pick it up. So I was once teaching in a financial firm in New York, and I said that, and then I looked up and I saw the complete panic on everyone's faces. And I said, okay, for you, maybe just twice. Let it ring twice. You don't have to let it ring 3 times. But honestly, are we going to remember the phone rings and just breathe and then pick it up? Maybe, but more likely if we've also sat or walked, as I said, the posture doesn't matter, but it's some formal practice. And I also want to say before we sit together, it doesn't have to be some unthinkable amount of time each day. I have another friend, Amishi Jha, who's a scientist, neuroscientist in Miami, who studies mindfulness in high stress occupations like first responders, high performance athletes, the military. And what her lab has found was that if you practice formally, so I'll say sit and shorthand, if you sit 12 minutes a day, 3 to 5 times a week, your life will change. And I always tease her because we're friends. I say, well, 12 minutes a day, I don't know if it's that healthy to go for the bare minimum. But she was looking for the bare minimum because that's the scientific investigation, right? The lowest effective dose. It's like, how much aspirin do you actually have to take to deal with a headache? What's the lowest amount? And so that's what she found. I also say to her and to the world, in all honesty, again, that I'm the kind of person for whom 3 to 5 times a week is not easy because it'll be Monday and I'll think, I'll start on Wednesday. Then it'll be Wednesday and I'll think, I'll do it 3 times on Saturday and I'll never do it. But every day is every day. And that is actually easier for me. So if you're going to explore and experiment with having a regular practice, you can experiment, and see what structure helps support you, because that's the whole point. It's not punishing yourself. It's what's going to help support you, and actuating it. Maybe it's not every day. Maybe it's very brief, and if you don't have 12 minutes some day and you only have 3, do the 3. Maybe some days it's only short moments many times. It's fine. But see what the effect is on you, what really helps you. And in the end, cultivating more mindfulness will really instill this option of a different relationship. Even when, a previously very unwelcome emotion comes, we're not jumping up and down with joy, like, oh, great, I'm feeling this. But it's different, right? When we're not piling on.